Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to launch this second block of our conference. The plan is to talk about the present and the future, to view Czech-Israeli relationships from today's viewpoint and to consider their future development, to consider the development of the Czech society and of the Israeli society, and where we are likely to be in 25 years' time. We've heard a lot of things, and perhaps things from the past can suggest the future. At the end of the last panel, we touched upon the present condition of Czech-Israeli relationships, that they are supported across the public, across the political spectrum. Nevertheless, that there are many issues or questions arising in the context of the Czech Republic as part of the European Union, which also affects our relations. I'd like to thank Magdalena Křížová for coming. She is going to speak about culture. I'd like to thank Shlomo Avineri. He has arrived from Jerusalem, is a frequent visitor of Prague with his roots in Třebíč. I'd like to thank Jiří Schneider and Daniel Kummerman, my father's colleagues in Israel. Jiří is no longer a civil servant, but Jiří still works for the state, for the government. And I'm going to promote a very open debate. First of all, I'd like to ask Shlomo for saying a few words from his perspective. What do Czech-Israeli relations look like? What do Israeli-European relations look like? In what directions are they likely to develop? And what will be the future of Czech-Israeli relations? My name is Tomáš Bojar. I'm self-employed and I worked in the several institutes. Shlomo, yours the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little bit frightened because I know the three former ambassadors. I never met all of them at the same time. It's a little bit of a frightening experience. I think I overcome the trauma. And perhaps one way of trying to address your question, Thomas, is to try to suggest that we are celebrating today not only 25 years of resumption of diplomatic relations between Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic and Israel, and not only, of course, the role of Václav Havel, but we are perhaps celebrating something in a way much more fundamental that has to do with the changes of 1989. And perhaps a Czech audience will not be as aware of it as some of us in Israel are. Obviously, 1989 was a dramatic change and a return to one's own history in this area, in this region, and of course in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. Something similar happened also in Israel. Because since 1967, and even before that, since 1967 we didn't have diplomatic relations with any Soviet bloc country except Romania, which was sui generis. And even before that, the relations with the Soviet bloc were basically very full. 1947-49 was a very deep relationship, of course, with, also had to do with a deep relationship with the Czechoslovak support for arms for Israel. But basically since 1950, Israel was cut off from Central and Eastern Europe. And this meant that for many Israelis who had either individual or family roots in Central and Eastern Europe, we were cut off from part of our history on a biographical level, but also on a historical level. Zionism started in Central and Eastern Europe. Most Jewish people, until the Holocaust, lived in Central and Eastern Europe. It was mentioned that my family has roots in Trebich. One of my grandfathers was born in Brno. I was born in Bielsko in Poland. One of my grandfathers was born in Békéscsaba in Hungary. I mean, we were all cut off, and not only personally, but also intellectually and spiritually from Central and Eastern Europe. All Israeli political parties, with some exception, had their roots in Central and Eastern Europe pre-1948, mainly in the interwar period. So 1989, and the opening and the changes in Eastern Europe, and therefore the very dramatic visit of President Havel, meant also not just relations with the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, but relations with our own history and part of our own roots. And today, the fact that Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and this includes, for better or for worse, also Russia and Ukraine, which are of course much more problematical diplomatically and politically and intellectually, still, they are part of the history of Israel. In a way which is not usually the way in which we teach our history, Israel is a successor state not only to the British Mandate, not only to the Ottoman Empire, but also to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and to the Russian Empire, for better or for worse. You know, some aspects are a little problematic. So when we celebrate, as we celebrate today, 25 years of diplomatic relations with the Czech Republic, in a more fundamental way, we celebrate also something of a return of Israel to its historical roots. I mean, the historical roots of the Jewish people are, of course, in Eretz Israel. For 2,000 years, and certainly the last millennium, so much of Jewish history, intellectual, religious, etc., was happening in this part of the world. So Israel is not in Europe, we are not part of Europe, but we are in a way of Europe, in many, many respects, and this is why the meaning of the visit, and it was a very dramatic and festive meaning when President Havel, also, as it was mentioned earlier, came with a very large group of Jews from Czechoslovakia. This was very significant. On the more specific issue of Israeli-Czech relations, let me just make one or two comments, and then I think it will lead also to what I think is the possibilities of the future. The visit of President Masaryk in Palestine in 1927 was mentioned, and it was a very important, again, moment in the history of the Jewish community, very small, very weak, basically isolated from the world and in a way also isolated from the majority of the Jewish people. It was very significant because here you had one of the most popular and important and moral leaders of Europe visiting the Jewish community in Palestine. So the moral support was very important. And those of us who know the history of and the biography of President Masaryk know that there is also a background to it. Not just 1927 in Palestine. Thomas Masaryk was crucial at the 1890s when there was a very terrible blood libel in this country, in Polna. Looked medieval, but it happened in 1890. And he, as a humanist, as a Czechoslovak patriot, and as a liberal, very clearly defended not only the individual Jewish person who was persons who were accused, but the whole idea that you have to defend Jews against blood libel. This is really something that has to be done, and every decent human being has to stand up against this sort of lie. So the relationship between Thomas Masaryk and the Jewish people go deeper, and the role that Thomas Masaryk played in public discourse and also on the legal issues that have to do with Poland were very, very crucial. Beyond that, I think there are two things which I think we have to bear in mind. One is very political, and I think most of you will agree with me. The second is more problematic. What made Czechoslovakia between the two world wars, under the leadership of Thomas Masaryk, so very important for the Jewish people generally and for the Jewish community in Palestine, was the fact that of all the successor states that set up in 1948, Czechoslovakia was the only one who maintained a democratic and liberal tradition until 1938. All the other countries, I don't want to mention them, because some of them, most of them today democratic, I don't want to insult anybody, but none of the countries surrounding Czechoslovakia in 1938 until 1938 was democratic. And it's a democratic tradition of the Czechoslovak people, and Masaryk had also Slovak rules. I think I don't have to remind people in part of this. Meant also something in terms of the ability to maintain a democratic structure in an environment which at that time was not democratic. Something similar happening to Israel. Under very difficult conditions, Israel maintains a democracy. When we compare ourselves, I'm saying it as a political scientist, when we compare ourselves to the ideal democracy, which doesn't exist anywhere in the world, except in some textbooks of some of my academic friends, we may not be A+, we may be B+. In the real world, not bad, especially if you live in a kind of environment in which we live. And so between the Czech people and Israel, there is something very deep in terms of values, in terms of tolerance, and in terms of the ability not just to maintain democratic ideas, but also to institutionalize them in reality under very difficult conditions. So it is it's beyond just diplomatic relations. It has to do with some very deep roots that we have in common. The other issue is a little bit more problematic because some of my Israeli friends may not agree with me. Israel is a secular society, Czech Republic is a secular society. But both societies relate to a religious tradition in different ways. I mean, you cannot, I'm saying it is a very secular Jew, you cannot separate the religious tradition of the Jewish people and the fact that some Jews today are religious from the fact that Israel is a political state that has to address the complex issue of the relationship of state and religion. I'm not suggesting that we always address it in the right way, but there is, despite the fact that Israel is and will continue to be a secular country and a secular society, there is a religious dimension that you cannot overlook. If you overlook it, you do not understand Israel. And in a different way, and correct me if I'm wrong, Czech Republic also has, Czech nationalism also has a link to a religious tradition, to Jan Hus and everything that happened later, of course, in this country, in this region. While Jan Hus was obviously a religious leader, a religious reformer, but he's considered to be by many Czechs as part of the tradition of the Czech nation. So this ambivalence, which sometimes creates problems. I don't know about Czech, but I know about Israeli reality. It suggests something that we have to look, and we have it in common. It's very easy to be as laïque as the French are, and we see the problems that the French now have with the laïcité, which is in a way ahistorical and creates problems for minorities. A French, if I may just say, a French colleague visited us in Jerusalem. He's a French philosopher, Jewish, atheist, communist, laïque. I mean, you realize the profile. And we were walking at Mount Scopus, and he saw two Arab Muslim girls, students at the university, dressed in a traditional, not very extreme, but in a traditional female Muslim dress. So he asked me, who are they? So I said, well, I think they are women. I think they are students. I think they are Arabs. I think they are Muslims, and I think they are a little religious. So he said, and you allow them to dress like this in a public space like the university? So I said to him, what do you think you are? You think you're in Republican France? You are in a Jewish state. So this is really part of the dilemma that we live with, and I think we are trying to address it. I think the relations between Israel and the Czech Republic are deep, not only because of raison d'etat, not only because of history, which I mentioned, but because of values. I think the Czech Republic, and this may be a challenge to the Czech Republic, is today in a situation in which its policy on the Middle East and on other issues is not exactly autonomous. Part of the price you pay for the wonderful achievement of the European Union is that you're not totally autonomous in your foreign policy. It doesn't mean that you have given up your autonomy. It doesn't mean that there is a European Union state. But you have to take into account, in a very complex relationship with almost 30 countries, a very particular way of looking at things, and you have to fit into it because you don't want to be outside of this club, and this is a very important club. So I have no doubt that the relationship between the Czech Republic and Israel on the bilateral level will continue to be as deep and as open and frank and close as they were before. I think it is very important for the Czech Republic, and I'm not saying it in a way of criticism, but in a way of hope, not to lose its identity, its history, its moral commitments, just because you are members of the European Union. We see different countries in the European Union having different policies regarding the Middle East. I mean, German policy and French policy and British policy are basically their own policy. Czech Republic is not as large country as those three countries, but to maintain the specificity and the history and the values of Czech-Israeli, Czech-Jewish relationship is something that I have no doubt the Czech Republic will maintain and cherish also in the future. Thank you very
much. Děkuji. Bylo zajímavé slyšet vaše srovnání týkající se Francie a české husitské tradice. Já většinou argumentuji tím, že uvádím, že vysvětlení té tradičně nízké úrovně antisemitismu, míry antisemitismu v české společnosti je způsobeno nízkou mírou religiozity v České republice. A Saša zmínil Dalaj Lámu, papeže a Izrael jako tři položky, které zmínil Václav Havel ve svém novoročním projevu. Vztahy s Vatikánem nejsou doposud uzavřeny, protože nebyla podepsána s Vatikánem doposud žádná smlouva. Pokud jde o jiné sousední země, tak ty mají smlouvy s Vatikánem a my jsme možná jediný členský stát Evropské unie, který takovou smlouvu nemá podepsanou s Vatikánem. Já bych argumentoval také tím, nebo uvedl, že pro nás bylo snadnější navázat, vytvořit dobré vztahy s Izraelem, než vytvořit je s Vatikánem. To je součást té sekulární povahy české společnosti, s tím souhlasím. Já bych chtěl nyní předat slovo Danielovi. How do you see from, when you look at the current debate, when you follow the what happens in the Czech Republic, when you follow the Czech position, the European position, what is the dynamics? How much is our official policy or our society influenced by the process of Europeanization of the Czech mind? Well, I prepared my contribution in English, so I will have to translate myself. When I was leaving Israel, one of the last things that I did was I wrote an article to Jerusalem Post about what the approaching membership of the Czech Republic in the European Union would bring. I was leaving Israel in 2003, and in 2004 we became a new member of the European Union. And in my article I focused what the new member states can mean for the European Union and its policy. And in that article I mentioned that Europe projects to Middle East and to Israel all sins of its past, whether it's racism, It is repeated often that Israel is functioning on a racist basis. And to give you an example, from the Second World War, there was negative attitudes to Germans that was racist based. Very often Israeli policy is also labeled as colonial, and this is again the European sin that is projected on this relationship. And another thing that plays a role here are some modern trends in the thinking in the West, postmodernism, political correctness. All these are Israel is said to break these or be in conflict with these. It is also being accused of radical left, being on the radical left, and also Muslim minorities play a role in the Western Europe. So all these are things that I meant the new member states do not have. We do not have this pseudo-modern trends, this historic experience, the radical left. So we are bringing a new perspective, a new stream that could change the European thinking and attitude. And I have to admit that I was wrong. I was deeply wrong in my article. What I see happening in the past years is exactly what I just described. I try to analyze the common foreign policy of the European Union, and all these trends that I mentioned, unfortunately, are still here. They did not change after the entry of the new member states, and the only thing that we do is, or they become even, these strengths are even stronger, and the only thing that we can do is to mitigate this and together with the Netherlands and Germany, as it was already mentioned, in some cases also with Italy, and sometimes we also get support from Hungary and Poland. So the Czech Republic currently more has its certain political weight, and corresponding to its weight it has a certain influence, but still, and thanks to the liberal tradition and deeply rooted relationships, we still are seen in act in the European Union as a mitigating factor. But unfortunately, I think we cannot do more at the current situation. We do not have enough strength to change this negative trend. And some of you who follow in more detail this politics will agree with me probably that this policy is absolutely inefficient. The only player in the Middle East are the United States, and the European Union is the biggest payer, but it is not the biggest player. It does not want to admit that it is not the big player because somebody is trying to harm it, but that the reason is that it is doing irrational policy that is leading nowhere and that is based on myths. Thank you. I would like to ask Jiří now how he sees the Czech reality. We will stay with the political scene, with the policies. It was mentioned also during the previous panel that there was some concerns about what would be the attitude of the new government, what impact would the new government have on those 25 years of successful Czech-Israeli relationships. And in the past, some presidents were more pro-Israeli, some were less pro-Israeli, and the same applied also to the ministers of foreign affairs. But nevertheless, the policy of the Czech Republic was consistent, and then when Miloš Zeman became president, he made the first journey abroad, exactly to Israel. And the government of Bohuslav Sobotka was the first Czech government that actually sat at the common session in Israel. So this was today's government who participated in this session according to the previously prepared schedule. With the exception of some individuals, this political line was not disrupted. Or is there something changes? This is a question that I would like to ask you. Whether this is, we can attribute this to a certain inertia, or whether there is genuine effort to maintain these good relationships. Thank you. I will try to describe what happened in the past 25 years and put it in the context of what I expect from the future. I'm afraid that the situation will deteriorate. What we described, the relationships plus or minus keeping a continuity, is something that will not last because our politics is becoming shallower and shallower. You mentioned that we have no radical left in the Czech Republic, but what are the basis of our policy? Some of the European states projected their sins onto their relationship with Israel, and that meant that their domestic policy followed traditional political schemes. But what we are seeing nowadays are very shallowly based political attitudes. We see it not only in the Czech Republic but also in other countries. So I am a bit afraid on the political level. When I focus on the social level, I think that our societies became extraordinary, integrated, interlinked. I visited Israel 4 years after Havel's visit, and I saw a great energy and will to compensate those 50 years that were lost since 48, basically. So these were not only renewed visits, but there was also interest to act together, to do some enterprise together. And as you mentioned, Mr. Avineri mentioned that you reconnected with your past, and also we reconnected with our past. An important part of this visit was the convention of Czechoslovak Jews. My impression from that, although I was not present at that journey, was that this journey was very emotive experience for everyone. It was a very emotive experience when Vím Jeloma, there were a gathering of thousands of people who were singing Czechoslovak anthem. I think that nothing like that happened during visits to other countries among the local Czech community. But I had a problem there, because if Czechoslovakia was preserved, then connections or links with the Czechoslovak Jews in Israel could be one of the roots from which we could renovate our identity. But as Czech Republic and Slovakia, it was much more difficult for us because Czech and Slovak Jews, they were had a link to Czechoslovakia. So we could not reconnect to Czechoslovakia as Israel reconnected to the roots of Zionism as a movement, self-determination movement. We could not do that. And I realized one thing, and I have to repeat it again and again, and that was that we as the society over the past 25 years failed to support, to show proper support to our to Czechs abroad. And Zionism is good and doing that. It can rely on people living in diaspora. We are not able to do that. We are not good at doing this. And I realized that the nostalgia for the pre-war Czechoslovakia is in fact wane, because we cannot reconstitute the plurality that existing. The relationship between Czechs and Jews were not idyllic. They were, although they were good, but still there was some competition, there was some tension, and it was a revelation for me when I learned how many people who emigrated at the time, just before the Second World War, were good Jewish merchants who worked for Czech companies. We maybe do not realize that with Jews who left Czechoslovakia, we lost some of the most skilled people. And we are not able to reconnect with that, to reconstitute that. And Tomáš may confirm that I tried to lay some foundations for increasing the volume of trade and investments between Czech Republic and Israel. But I still think that on the Czech side there is not enough, that the potential is not fully used. We are not able to fully use the potential, the entrepreneurship and involvement of logical, good thinking, both in science and business. So we reconnected with something that we lost, and we are not able to reconstitute it. And also in terms of the identity of the Czech state, I'm not sure whether we are able to use our relationship to Israel to strengthen our Czech identity and to strengthen our role in Europe, in the European Union. I believe that the Europe should stay a Europe that is diverse, and I cannot imagine any other Europe than a Europe where every country, every state comes with its historic experience, and its experience is respected by other countries. And I have a last comment, just for explanation. It is interesting to see understanding or analogy between secular Israelis and anti-clerical Czechs. This attitude that they share is not an attitude of not respecting religion. It is an attitude of being strongly anti-clerical. This is something on which that is common for a big part of Israeli community or society and big part of the Czech society. Although I'm not sure whether this is something on which we can build our stronger position in the European Union or richer relationships. But I see it as a way how to start mentioning also cultural relationships. I would like to mention that The prominent figures were Viktor Fischer and Viktor Gagan. This was a person that spanned various dimensions. It was Israeli diplomat and Czech writer. So who will be the people who will support these cultural interlinks between Israel and Czech Republic? Maybe this is something that we should ask our colleague on my right. I would like to say that the relationships between countries are not developed only by politicians, but they also depend on this network of culture, scientific, university links, and relationship between individual institutions, individuals, universities are also very important. During the first 40 years of the existence of the Israeli states, there were no such links. They could not exist, and after 25 years ago they were re-established, and a lot of things were in fact established, and probably also the perspective from Israel is different than the perspective from the Czech Republic. There is many more Israelis who visited Prague or Czech Republic, and there is very little Czechs who visit Israel. It is also interesting to see that Israelis do not read Czech authors, Czech books, because the current Czech literature is not translated into Hebrew, and on the other hand there are many books of past and current Israeli authors that are translated into Czech and are read and published in the Czech Republic. So, in some way, we know each other. Also, this knowledge is asymmetrical. Or how is it?
Thank you for giving me the floor. I have prepared a summary of literal-cultural exchange because I am a translator of literature, and what you've said is true, but only partially. Yes, the asymmetry is here. In Israel, Czech authors have been translated since 1920s. There were first translations of Čapek's books, and this continuity existed and still exists. Bibliographical databases suggest that there are more books translated from Czech into Hebrew than from Hebrew into Czech. This is because Czech literature could have been published all the time. We should not forget Viktor Gagan, a Czech-Israeli personality, and yet another important personality is Ruth Bondy. She's almost 90 years old at the moment. She's a writer, journalist, publisher. She used to write in Hebrew, later in Czech, and what she did for Israeli readers were Jaroslav Hašek books, Kundera's books, Štvorecký, Pavel Kohout's books, and I must have forgotten many other authors translated by Ruth Bondy. Ivan Klima, I believe one of his books has been translated into Hebrew, and Harabal, obviously. And who else? Yes, Ruth Bondi, Ruth Bondi is a great personality. She's a great personality beyond others. I believe there are no other translators translating into Hebrew. Yes, there were other translators who translated Czech authors via different languages. Vaculik's book was published in Hebrew, translated from German, which is quite unfortunate in my opinion, as Vaculik was the master of words. Ruth Bondi does not translate authors of the last 25 years, with one exception, and it's Michal Vivek's books. My husband is also a translator. He's Israeli, Per Friedman. He translates into Czech, and he's perhaps he's likely to continue with what Ruth Bondi started. He translated Joachim Topol's book, and there's yet another book waiting to be published. And also Ladislav Fuchs' Spalovač mrtvol will be published in Israel, and we are awaiting the response of the Israeli audience, because the topic is extremely strong. So let me now say a few words about translations from Hebrew into Czech. There was no tradition, no continuity. The first translation by a Hebrew author was published in the 1990s, and paradoxically it was a marginal book. It was Cesta do Encharot by Amosen Kenon, a vision, utopia about the future of Israel. It's a very leftish text. In the 1990s there were other books published. Amos Oz, translated by Jiřina Šedinová, David Shmuel Josef Agnon, translated by Jindřich Vacek. These are our two greatest translators from modern Hebrew. But the pace is accelerating somehow, and in academia there is a new department of Hebrew studies, and there are the first graduates. So now there are more translators from Hebrew than those two mentors, and when compared to the 1990s, when there were 1 to 2 Israeli books published per year, we have dozens of them published every year, and Czech readers have the opportunity to become acquainted with a large variety of Hebrew, of Israeli authors, Edgar Keret, authors like Yochi Brandes, Said Kashula, an Israeli Arab writing in Hebrew, Avraham Yehoshu, representing Sephard cultural environment in Israel. So we've moved to the right direction, and I hope the interest in Israel will also remain existent. I am very much surprised that there are more Czech books translated in Hebrew than vice versa. In the last 25 years, the trend has reverted. We've talked about Ruth Bondy. Ruth Bondy was in 92. Soon. Then there is Viktor Fischl and no one else. There are no critics in Israel who would assess Czech books to be published, and when doing such assessment they use other languages, which is not the right solution. So unfortunately I believe Czech literature will not be so widely available in Israel. I read statistics about translations of Israeli authors, and the number, if we forget about German, English, and French, Czech is number one when it comes to the languages to which Israeli books are translated. Before I launch our Q&A session, I'd like to ask Shlomo to comment on what we've just talked about.
Very brief on the issue of culture. There is now, for the first time, a Czech cultural center in Tel Aviv. And it is very important because traditionally the idea was to approach Israelis of Czechoslovak background. So you address yourself to a small audience and to a dwindling audience. And the idea of the center, which I think very, very positive, and I see already some of the first results, is that you acquaint a younger generation of Israelis with what's happening today in Czech arts, in painting, in Czech poetry. It may take some time until it will produce more translation. I think the first time you have a center in Israel that presents Czech contemporary culture to the Israeli audience, and I think this will develop. The Polish people have been doing the same in the Polish embassy. We are doing nothing Israeli.
Yes, and Czech film, Czech movies are well known to Israel, and they are shown very often as compared to Israeli films. So, in a way, in the field of culture, we've had some relations, good relations, and in addition to those political relations, these cultural and political and business relations can continue to live quite successfully. 2 remarks. Last week I visited Israel, and when you meet people, common people on the streets, shop assistants, etc., he will learn what they think about the Czech Republic. What I learn from them is either the name of a football player, a soccer player, or the fact that there are many casinos in Prague. This is what they learned in the 1990s. The impression of a Czech who travels to Israel is that they immediately feel or hear Russian, and I was quite surprised by a big neon sign, Restaurant Putin, in Israel. That's something very new as compared to Israel 25 years ago. Wasn't it Rasputin? No. Ladies and gentlemen, please use the microphone and Karel Schwarzenberg will receive the floor. Well, I believe we have forgotten to speak about one very important fact, as mentioned by Mr. Schneider. We should not forget that prior to World War II, 2/3 of Czech Jews spoke German. Only 1/3 of them spoke Czech. And obviously, those who left, who emigrated, they no longer felt connected to post-war Czechoslovakia because they had no one to talk to. A very typical anecdote, a story of the Schulte family. They had a small textile factory in the Trutnov region. They were wealthy people. I know Schulte's son. He grew up in Austria. He became the Minister of Culture, representing the Austrian Social Democrats. And he grew up in pre-war Czechoslovakia, and he spoke very good Czech. In his book, he describes the atmosphere of Jewish families in Prague. When they came home with friends speaking Czech, they were forbidden to speak Czech at home. Then Hitler came, and Schulte's father during the World War II obviously started to support Czech nation. He was put in jail, but he escaped, and then he was sent to Hamburg and Rotterdam, and he received part of the harbor for Czechoslovakia, and he returned to Prague to see his mom being expelled from her flat in Vinohrady because she only spoke German, and he felt very disappointed. I know many people who were faithful to Czechoslovakia and who had big problems during restitutions, and this is something we should talk about openly. Why no member of the Pečkas family appeared in the Czech Republic. It's a hidden problem. Michal is also a translator. He also translated a book by Amos Oz. Well, I'm not going to object. His Excellency, I would like to say that the language issue applies to Moravian Jews and out of Prague Jews. The Prague Jewish community was a very specific community where most people obviously at home spoke German, and at the same time they mastered another language, Czech, started from Franz Kafka. That's why the pre-war Jewish community served as a glue between the German aspect and the Czech aspect or element. They felt to be more Czechoslovakian than German or just Czech, and I'm referring to Viktor Fischl again, who writes that in pre-war Czechoslovakia there were Czechs and Slovaks and then Czechoslovaks, and they were Jews. This is exaggerated, obviously, but it means something. Kafka originated, or his father originated, from a purely Czech-speaking community from South Bohemia. In the village they spoke Czech only. His father was a successful businessman, and then he became a German-speaking person, and this is the language in which Kafka was raised.
I'm very glad that Karl Schwarzenberg raised the issue of language, which is, of course, a crucial issue in the history of this region. A few months ago, there was a trial in Israel that finished about some of the manuscripts of Kafka. I mean, Kafka is on one hand the most famous Czech writer of the 20th century. He wrote in German, and the Israeli think that he's a Jewish writer, and therefore the manuscript have to be in Israel. So you understand that we are all fighting over a very polyglot tradition. Since Michael just left, he translated Amos Oz, and the second page of his wonderful book, Amos Oz's book, Story of Love and Darkness, he describes his parents, and he said they were raised in Russian and Polish, and they spoke Hebrew on an ideological level, but they dreamt in Yiddish. So you have here the issue of identity, which is so very crucial in every national movement, and was so very crucial here, is also crucial in our case. And let me just add that when I was working on my book on Herzl, I found out that one of the reasons which triggered Herzl towards looking for a national solution for the Jewish problem outside of Europe had to do with clashes in Prague and in Vienna, especially in Prague, between Czech speakers and German speakers, where some of the Jewish people, who most of them spoke German, found themselves in the middle of a clash of two national movements, each of which was a little bit uncomfortable with the fact, I mean, the German speakers were already becoming a little racist, didn't think that the Jews are really Germans, despite the fact that they spoke German, and for many Czech nationalists, Jewish people were speaking German, ergo they belonged to the German view. So being caught in the middle between two national movements, and in one of his very interesting points, Herzl said, one day all those nations will gain a homeland and we will lose ours. What is ours? Not Palestine, not yet. For him, our homeland is a multicultural, relatively tolerant Austro-Hungarian empire, which was being disintegrating into national issues. So thank you very much for mentioning this.
I wanted to add one more angle to it, and then Irena asked for microphone. I think that there is, from the point of view of the Czech culture and Czech literature and film, there is a huge group which is very favorable to Prague and to this place, and this is the Russian-speaking Jewish. Yes. Coming from the Soviet Union, because for them, even in the 70s and 80s, this was the Western most free and most rich and most cultural edge of the Soviet Empire, or at least one of those. They come here very often, and not only to Karlovy Vary, but also to Karlovy Vary. They come to Prague, they read Czech literature, they know from the past what they have read in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, Kharkov, Donetsk, and they are naturally more inclined from the present-day Israeli society for some roots here. Not that they were born here, they were more born to the east, but culturally they feel some kind of bonds. More than the Israeli Sabres, who are part of the melting pot, born in the Middle East with completely different history and completely different background. So for us, and for our embassy and Czech Center to target the Russian-speaking 1.25 million of those who were born in the Russian-speaking families, this is the future of keeping those bonds together and keeping those ties. Yeah.
Well, maybe Tomáš just answered my question, but actually I wanted to ask about the fourth and fifth generation in Israel, which has European, especially Eastern European roots. If you think they will keep it, also because many of them got European passports, or if you think they would really become sort of Levantine type, and they would stop to be interested to Europe also because of the European policies and so on and so on, which also may also affect the Czech-Israel relation, that simply there won't be this sort of natural connection. Thank you.
Are you ready for a 2-hour seminar on the Israeli culture? I think you raised a very crucial issue about the self-identity of Israel, which is a multicultural society, despite the fact that when you say multiculturalism to Israelis are very nervous about it. But it is a multicultural society, not between Jews and Arabs only, but also within the Jewish community. And one of the paradoxes is that when you look at some of the speakers who speak for Middle Eastern Jews and maintain that that they should maintain their culture. Many of them are French-speaking Jews from Morocco who studied at the Sorbonne and find Ashkenazi Jews very ethnocentric and very provincial because they present French culture. So when you come to some of the identity issues of, you said Levantine, I never use the term, but the Levantine element in Israeli society, it is also looking to Europe in a way, and it is looking to a different Europe, to Europe of France. And this is really a joke, I'm sure to tell you. What will be the second official language of Israel in the year 2050? Hebrew, after Russian. Not going to happen, don't worry.
Well, we may be better off with export of our culture and books and already translated. Anyone else?
The lady on the left. Well, I would just like to mention one thing regarding Czech-Israeli or Czech-Israeli memory, and it relates to 1968, the spring of 1968, in the literary listi. There was an article published by Pavel Kohout, and it said, "I'm thinking about one small country surrounded by enemies who want to destroy it." I'm not quoting it exactly. And I'm not, he said, I'm not speaking about the Czechoslovakia in 1938, I'm speaking about the Israel of this year, that means 1968. And I think that in the Czech cultural environment, some link could be felt also on this level between Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia and Israel. And also Ephraim Kisher was a very popular Israeli author in Czechoslovakia. He was not mentioned, so I wanted to mention him.
Just to write a note which may not be known to people outside of Israel. The Prague Spring of 1968, of course, had a lot of echo in Israel, and one of the most popular songs in Israel in the late 1960s, written by Yaron Nomron, a very relatively known Israeli personality and writer, was Shir Shechalamti al Prague, a dream that I dreamt about Prague, which is about the freedom movement and the Prague Spring. It was for months #1 on the Israeli, what do you call it? Hit list.
I listen to Israeli radio quite often, and this song is still played in the radio. Arik Einstein recorded this song, and I have one interesting comment. I mentored Moshe Dayan, and the question he asked me was on which eye did Jan Žižka wear his pants. That means with which eye he could not see, which eye had he lost. I did not have the banknote on which with the portrait of Jan Žižka with me, so I could not answer to him, but he told me that the Žižka's strategy, probably military strategy, probably inspired Mr. Sharon, although in his military strategy. And I would also like to say that because the topic of our meeting is Czech Republic and Israel today, and we should take a lesson from Israel that the size of territory and the number of population is not the most important thing. It is important to implement technology quickly. For instance, in Israel, they started to look for a vaccine against cancer in Israel, against all kinds of vaccine, and nowadays it is said that this vaccine will be available in 2 years on the market. And one more thing, I think that the feeling of solidarity and security in Israel is really big. I do not understand people who are saying that they are afraid to go to Israel. I feel contrary, very safe to when I go to Israel. Thank you.
Tak, prosím.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kamal. My question goes to Mr. Shlomo Aviner. You mentioned identity. That's the classical topic of Václav Havel, political thinking. As far as I know, part of the national identity is, for modern states, is a currency. Czech Republic will sooner or later face a fundamental question. Shall Czech Republic join European Eurozone, Euro, yes or no? I wonder what is from your perspective, from Israel, your opinion about, is this going to be a good decision for Czech Republic to give up Česká koruna, or what is your opinion about this? Thank you very much.
Which bound you will go to?
Another 2-hour lecture, I mean, it's too complicated for that.
Dámy a pánové,
ladies and gentlemen, please let me now give the floor to each of the panelists to say a few words to conclude this event, and after that we will also pass the floor to His Excellency Karel Schwarzenberg. Well, I have a comment regarding some memories regarding the relationships between Czechoslovakia and Israel. The building next to this one was the first Israeli embassy in the world because the arms that were supplied to the Israel in 1948 for various reasons, whether they were idealistic reasons by inherited from Tomáš Masaryk, or whether it were the reasons pursued by the communists, helped to establish the Israeli state. And the next building housed the very first embassy of Israel, and I had the honor to make a tour for the delegation from Israel around this building, and then the Israeli delegation left. They were all members of the Jewish brigade in Aden. They were wearing khaki uniforms. They were tanned. They had military training, and they were quite different to many Jewish friends we had from the area of culture, journalism, literature, etc. So my mother looked at them and she said, well, if I didn't know who they were, I would think that it was African troops that were visiting on the visit. But you found also your pictures, your own paintings in that building in 1990. Is that true?
Let me just add that I remember as a kid, people remember as a kid in Palestine, two things. That during World War II there were a lot of Czech immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Czechoslovakia to Palestine, who volunteered not to the British Army, but to the Czech Army, and they ended up in the Czech Flying Corps in England, which was very crucial in the Battle of Britain, because Czech pilots were very, very crucial. And let me add another personal memory. As a kid, I was born in 1933. So in 1948, when Israel was established, I was in high school, 15 years old, in the youth movement, which was also a wing of the illegal Haganah self-defense force under the British. And we lived at that time in Herzliya, and the first Czech shipments of arms in March of 1948, they came at night to a small landing strip, which is still now a small airfield near Herzliya, near the Interdisciplinary Center today. And we were told that we have to come at night and unpack them. And I remember everything was greasy, it was all in oil paper, and we for the first time saw Czech rifles and also submachine guns. And of course, it was all in secret, but everybody in Herzliya knew about it, but it was totally secret. This was part of the myth of how you remember memories, and this was for a 15-year-old kid who for the first time held a submachine gun in his hand, and it was from Czechoslovakia. This was, I would say, a defining moment, but a very, very close and important memory.
Well, a few words to conclude. I don't really have much to add. Maybe one thing about which I thought just now is something that relates to cultural exchange, but also to scientific exchange, scientific collaboration between Czech Republic and Israel. In the beginning of our discussion, we talked about comparison between Czech relations with Israel and EU relations with Israel. And what I see in recent years is a disconcerting trend of boycotts, or not only of boycotts of Israel, of economic boycott of Israel, which of course is nonsense, but also of boycotts in a cultural sphere, in academic sphere, and I'm glad that this, at least to my knowledge, did not find any response in the Czech Republic. There is no tendency for such boycotts in the Czech Republic, and I would just think it extremely stupid to try to build barricades and to close ears to the voice of the Israeli intellectuals, Israeli figures from all parts of the society that can give a message about what is the current situation in Israel and what are different perspectives in Israel. I would like to add that there is no such a trend in the Czech Republic. We have one former Minister of Foreign Affairs who is always willing to sign similar petitions. Jirka, well, my wish is that the relationship also in the academia sector are richer. Unfortunately, there is not much difference between whether there is boycott or there is no boycott on the Czech side, because there are not many links established, for instance, in the scientific sphere. Of course, I agree with you that any boycott is nonsense. What I would wish, I visited Israel again recently, as I mentioned, and we used to have consulates in Jerusalem also. So I went also through some materials from the archives, and I saw that at the consulate at Moshe Magermanit, the pilots that later went to Great Britain were received by the Czech consul. When I was in Israel, when I worked in Israel, at that time there was euphoria about possible peace, achieving peace, and there was euphoria. There were ideas that the embassy might be moved to Jerusalem, and nowadays it is something that is hard to imagine. But so I would wish that the relationships would be such that any debates about moving the embassy to Jerusalem would not be just a dream. We have been discussing Czech-Israeli relationship here, and I would like to add one historic fact that is not very much known. For the establishment of Czechoslovakia, the position of the United States was very important. That means the position of President Wilson. And two things that helped to change the U.S. position, original position was ordinary for independent Czechoslovakia was 300,000 demonstration in Chicago, and the second thing was the meeting between Wilson and Masaryk, and Brandeis helped to arrange that meeting between Masaryk and Wilson. And Brandeis said that it was his debt towards Masaryk for the Masaryk's attitudes to the blood trials in 1890s. And for his attitude. To stěhování ambasády do Jeruzaléma je téma, které jste tu zmínili, a to je docela zajímavé a souvisí s tím jedna zajímavá historka. Je tam takové parkoviště, které patří ruské církvi, a ruská ambasáda říká, tady bychom chtěli mít v jednu dobu své velvyslanectví, a je to doufám, že to tady bude pravda, že se to v Izraeli skutečně. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists, and I would like to pass the floor to the director of Václav Havel's library. Before I invite Karel Schwarzenberg, I would like to thank Tomáš Pojer, also the moderator of the first panel, Michal Žartovský, who unfortunately already had to leave us because he went to the airport. And I would also like to thank all the panelists. I would like to thank Gary Koren for great collaboration, for helping us to organize with his team this event and invite our friends. I would also like to remind you of the invitation to the Vinohrad Brewery, where we can continue informally in our discussions. And I would also like to thank the interpreters. I saw that many of you were using their services. Karel Schwarzenberg already said that he is a person with a very special relationship to Israel. He was one of those who welcomed the delegation that established the first Israeli embassy in the world in the building next to this one. Karel Schwarzenberg is also the co-founder of the Václav Havel's library. He is one of the friends of Václav Havel, who started as a chancellor, and he also we know him also from the post of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and from other posts, so he may provide a number of perspectives on Israel from the Czech point of view. So I would like to ask him for a concluding speech. It is getting quite late, my friends, so I think that I should not hold any long speech. Just one thing which I think is important. The Czech-Israeli relationship, although it had its downs, especially at the times of the communist era, when these relationships were very tense, and they were even cut in 1967, and still the sympathies survived, and this is really something unique in Central Europe. For those who did not live in the neighboring countries will probably not notice it, because these are things that are very subtle. For instance, one of them is the fact that the Czechoslovakia is the only country in the pre-war, between the wars, which had no limitations on Jewish students. I remember our group around Václav Havel, including Michal Žantovský, Kantor, or Jiří Křižan, me and others. Maybe we might be suspected of being a Zionist military group, but we were all very enthusiastic about Israel and its development, so this is why we wanted to re-establish the relationships as soon as possible. And one day I met in Vienna with a person who presented me to Simon Wiesenthal, and Wiesenthal said that he would like to visit Prague. I was excited, so I invited him to Prague, and in one of the Prague restaurants called Upavouka at Letná Street, we organized dinner for a group around Václav Havel with Elie Wiesenthal. And during that dinner, Wiesenthal stand up at one moment and he had a short speech in very good Czech. And he said that he would like to thank us for the most beautiful years of his life. That means the years when he could study architecture here in Prague, something that he could not do in Poland and in other countries. He said that these were the most beautiful years of his life, and we were all moved very much. We were almost moved to tears, because this to hear a Czech words from this great man was very emotional for us. And all this is to a great extent the work of President Masaryk, because Hilsneriada, as it is called, was of key importance in the life of the Czech nation. Blood libel trials in 1819. There was a lot of opposition against Masaryk, and it showed that there were as many anti-Semites in our country as in the neighboring countries. We must not forget that, for instance, one of the person that want to send Hilsner to death was the mayor of Prague, Paxa. This is sometimes forgotten, but Masaryk was completely alone in the beginning in his fight. His own students shouted at him that they would boycott him. All newspapers were against him, but he stood up to this challenge and he fought it alone, and the result of this fight was that the Emperor Franz Josef finally ordered to move the trial from Moravia to Písek, and the result was that the outcome of this process was still scandalous, but the death sentence was not awarded, only jail, imprisonment, and then Hilsner was released based on amnesty in 1917. Unfortunately, he was ill, so he died soon. But this fight did change the whole feeling in the Czech nation, and in the First Republic, that means between the First and Second World War, we were the only state where anti-Semitism was not officially recognized. That means it was not embodied in regulations. We were the only country, and this is the heritage that we have from that time. And one more remark: I lived in Vienna, in München, And Prague is the only city where it never happened to me, as opposed to those other named countries where I would be to a dinner. There would be a sympathetic couple, and once they left, the rest of the society would say, or somebody from this society would tell me, well, they are nice people, but you should know that they are Jews. This never happened to me in Prague. This happened to me in other cities which I mentioned. And in the beginning of the 1990s, the Minister of Foreign Reserves, the ambassador to Moscow and the ambassador to Washington were all of Jewish origin, and this was not discussed anywhere. This was simply not a topic of for discussion, and this is the precious heritage that we should keep. And now we are entering a new, very bad period or era. Some of you may probably have noticed that extremists on both sides of the political spectrum are in context or are in agreement or something. They not only go together to Moscow to pay homage to Putin, but also you probably saw that in the European Parliament there is collaboration between the extreme right and the extreme left. At this time, they focus on fight against Islam, but according to my historic experience, this inevitably would lead to anti-Semitism, because these groups never avoided sliding into anti-Semitism, and this time it would be from both sides, from the right and from the left. So we should be very aware of that, very careful about that. Every democracy, even our democracy and our young generation has to stand up to the challenge to defend democracy. In 1990 we thought that all the nightmares disappeared, but it is a mistake. They are coming back at full force, and I would like to draw your attention to that. And I'm very glad that I saw such big audience here, because these are mostly people who have knowledge, who are aware of these issues, but we should be aware of the fact that we will be entering stormy times again. Thank you for your attention.